My name is Sera, and I was 34 years old the night my father sat at a table full of his colleagues and told them I didn't really have a career. He didn't know I was in the room. He said it the way you say something you've said so many times it no longer feels like a choice, just a fact, worn smooth from handling. She putters around with her little projects. It's not a real job, honestly. She does her own thing. Someone at the table laughed, gently, the way people laugh when they're agreeing with you and don't want to be rude about it. I stood just past the edge of the conversation, holding a glass of water, and I let it go. What my father didn't know, what none of the people at that table knew, was that I had been holding something for 17 years. Not a grudge. Something quieter than that and considerably more official. A credential with my name on it. A record that certain people in that room would have recognized immediately if anyone had thought to ask. No one asked. By the end of that dinner, someone was going to read my name from a stage. And my father was going to be sitting close enough to hear every word. I wasn't nervous.
I want to be clear about that.
The daughter who puttered. My father is a man who respects legibility. I don't mean that as a criticism, exactly. I mean it as an observation I made early and have spent a long time sitting with. He respects things he can name at a dinner table. Things with a title, a salary range, a building you go to 5 days a week. He spent 31 years in industrial procurement, the business of sourcing and contracting heavy equipment for manufacturing operations, and he was good at it in the way that people who are built for a particular kind of work are good at it. Organized, consistent, loyal to a method that had always produced results. His name is Gerald.
People called him Jerry.
He had a firm handshake and a firm opinion about most things, and one of his firm opinions, formed sometime in my early 20s and never substantially revised, was that I had not found my footing professionally. My mother, Diane, was gentler about it. She would describe my work as complicated to explain or very specialized, which was her way of being kind while still acknowledging that she could not, in fact, explain it.
She meant well.
She always meant well. But kind vagueness and genuine understanding are different things, and what I had for my family for 17 years was the former. My older brother, Patrick, had a clear job. He managed logistics for a regional trucking company. You could explain it in one sentence. People nodded. My younger sister, Becca, had gone into nursing, also clear, also respected, also the kind of work that got a warm response at any table. And then there was me. My name is Sera, and I am an environmental compliance specialist.
I know.
I can already see your eyes doing what everyone's eyes do. I'll explain it because it matters for the rest of the story. Environmental compliance is the work of making sure industrial operations don't violate the laws and regulations that govern how they interact with the land, the water, and the air around them. It sounds bureaucratic. It is partly. It is also the work that stands between a poorly managed manufacturing site and a contaminated watershed. It is the work that gets done in field boots and filed in reports that nobody reads until something goes wrong, and then everyone reads them very carefully. I started in the field at 22, straight out of a bachelor's program in environmental science that my father had described as interesting but vague. I spent 3 years doing site assessments for a consulting firm, driving to industrial facilities in the early morning, taking samples, writing reports, getting my hours. At 25, I sat for the first of my professional licensing exams. I passed on the first attempt. Over the following 12 years, I accumulated 4 professional credentials. Each one required documented field hours, written examination, and periodic renewal. The most significant, the one that mattered most in my industry, the one that appeared at the top of my letterhead and at the bottom of every compliance report I signed, was a licensed environmental professional designation that I had held for 9 years by the time this story ends. In my state, fewer than 800 people hold that license. My father knew I had some kind of certification. He did not know what it meant. He did not ask, because by the time I earned it, he had already decided what kind of career I had, and that decision was load-bearing for him in ways I only came to understand later. I lived in a mid-sized city about 2 hours from my parents. I drove a 7-year-old sedan and rented an apartment that I had furnished slowly and well over the years. I did not have the outward markers of success that my family registered. No house yet, no spouse, no children, nothing they could point to and say, See, she made it. What I had was a client list, a licensing portfolio, and a reputation in a professional community that had nothing to do with my family's social world. Those two worlds had never intersected. Until the dinner. The anchor in my life, the person who had always understood what I did and why it mattered, was my mother's older sister, my Aunt Rosalind Kern. She was 67 years old by the time this story takes place, and she had spent 35 years as an environmental attorney before retiring to a house on a lake in the northern part of the state, and a life that involved a great deal of fly fishing, and a surprising amount of consulting work she did because she liked it, not because she needed it. Roz had been the one, 20 years earlier, who had handed me a brochure about environmental science programs and said, "You like being outside, and you like rules. This is both." I had looked at her and said, "That's not how I would describe myself," and she had said, "You wouldn't, but I would." And she'd been right. She was the only person in my family who had read my licensing documentation. Not because I had sent it to her with any dramatic intent. I sent it the way you send a sibling good news, because she was the closest thing I had to a professional peer in the family. She had written back, "Sera, this is a significant credential. Fewer than 800 in the state. Does your father know what this means?" I had written no, and "I'm not going to explain it to him." She had written back, "I know. I'm not telling you to. I'm just noting it for the record." That was Roz. She noted things for the record. She came to my licensing ceremony. She drove 4 hours each way and brought a card that said, on the inside, in her precise handwriting, 17 years from brochure to seal. Don't let anyone make it smaller than it is. I kept the card in my desk drawer. I looked at it sometimes after particularly long weeks. My father did not come to the ceremony. He had a prior commitment, a procurement conference, something that had been on the calendar. He had apologized sincerely, and I believed the sincerity, and I also knew that if the tables had been reversed, if Patrick had been receiving a professional license, the conference would have been rescheduled. I did not say this. I said it was fine, and in the way of things that are fine in the functional sense and not fine in the true sense, it was both. The 17-year misunderstanding. The story of how my father came to believe I didn't have a real career is not a story of cruelty. I want to be precise about that because the easy version of this story makes him a villain, and he isn't. He's a man who built his entire understanding of professional value around legibility, visible titles, visible buildings, visible pay stubs, and I had a career that operated largely out of sight, in fields and reports and regulatory filings with a professional community that had no overlap with his. When I was 23 and just starting out, he'd asked what I did on a typical day. I tried to explain field assessments, sampling protocols, regulatory thresholds, and watched his attention slide sideways before I got to the second sentence. He nodded. He moved on. He filed me under, still figuring it out, and as the years went by, and I did not acquire the visible markers he associated with professional arrival, he never updated the file. The problem was that I had stopped trying to update it for him. At 24, 25, 26, I had still been explaining, gently, when the subject came up. By 28, I had started deflecting. By 30, I had stopped bringing it up at all unless directly asked, and when directly asked, I gave the short version. Environmental compliance work, mostly industrial, which produced the nod and slide response and effectively ended the conversation. By 34, we had a functional détente. I came home for holidays. I was pleasant. I asked about his projects and listened to the answers. He asked how things were going, and I said fine, and he said good, and we moved on. It was a kind of peace that required both of us to avoid a particular set of questions. I had decided, somewhere around 31, that I didn't need him to understand. The work was real regardless of whether he could see it. The industry dinner changed the calculus. Not because I planned it, because it was never supposed to be a thing that happened at all. The dinner was the annual recognition event for the regional chapter of a Manufacturing and Industrial Operations Association, a trade organization that included my father's employer among its members. Gerald had been attending this dinner for 15 years. It was his professional world, the world he was fluent in, the world where he knew people and people knew him. His company's operations director, a woman named Celia Marsh, who had taken over the regional chapter's awards committee 3 years earlier, had reached out to my firm 8 months before the dinner. My firm had completed a multi-site compliance audit for one of the association's larger member companies the previous year, and the audit had flagged and resolved a significant regulatory exposure before it became a reportable incident. Celia's committee had decided to create a new category in their annual awards, Environmental Excellence in Industrial Operations, and they wanted to recognize the compliance work that had made the difference. My name was on the report. My license number was on the signature block. They called my firm. My firm contacted me. I was told, in October, that I would be receiving the first Environmental Excellence Award at the association's annual dinner in March. I did not tell my father. This was a choice I made, and I am still, sometimes, uncertain about. I could have called him. I could have said, "Your industry association is giving me an award. You should come." But something held me back, some quiet, stubborn part of me that had been building a professional life in a room he never looked into, and that wanted, just once, to have the room reveal itself on its own terms. I did not know, when I registered for the dinner, that my father's company table would be at seat assignments E3 through E10, 3 tables to the left of the podium. I found this out 2 weeks before the event, when the seating chart was finalized and sent to all attendees. I looked at it for a long time. Then I thought about Roz's card. Don't let anyone make it smaller than it is. I printed the seating chart. I put it in my bag. I did not change my registration. What he said before he knew I was there. I arrived at the Meridian Grand Ballroom at 6:40 on a Thursday evening in March. The dinner was a sit-down affair for approximately 220 people, tables of 10, a podium with a projection screen, the particular ambient noise of a professional event before it formally begins. Name badges on a table near the entrance. A cash bar doing steady business. I picked up my badge. I did not put it on immediately. I put it in my jacket pocket and carried my drink toward the edges of the room, getting oriented, before finding my assigned table. I was moving past a cluster of tables near the back left quadrant when I heard my father's voice. He was standing with 4 or 5 colleagues from his company, men and women I recognized from various holiday photos over the years, in the easy conversational cluster that forms at professional events when you know everyone around you. He had a drink in one hand and his badge already affixed to his lapel, and he was mid-sentence when I came within earshot. "No, she's always done her own thing. Environmental something. Sera. A beat. She's not unhappy. She just never really, she putters. It's not a real job, honestly. Not like Patrick's. Patrick actually manages people, has targets, all of that." Someone in the cluster made a sympathetic sound. "She's fine," my father said. I stopped worrying about it. She likes what she does. I stood 2 tables away with my drink and my badge in my pocket, and I let the sentence finish. My jaw did not tighten. My hands did not shake. Something in my sternum went very still, the way a room goes still in the moment before a sound reaches it, not absence but held breath. I turned and walked to my table, which was on the other side of the room. I put on my badge. Sera Kowalski, LEP, firm name, Environmental Consulting. I sat down. I introduced myself to the people at my table, 2 of whom were from firms I had worked with peripherally and who recognized my name with a small, genuine warmth of professional acknowledgement. I had a conversation about a regulatory update that had gone into effect in January. I ate the salad. Across the room, my father had found his table. He was animated, comfortable, at home in the way people are at home in the professional world they've spent 3 decades building. I watched him, briefly, the way you watch something from a distance when you know its shape is about to change. I finished my salad. I drank my water. I waited. The formal program began at 7:40. The association's regional president, a man named Bill Tarrant, 62, white-haired, with the particular authority of someone who has chaired enough meetings to have made peace with public speaking, opened with a brief address about the year's activities, the association's membership growth, a new apprenticeship program, standard event cadence. People listened with the partial attention of a room that knows the main courses are still coming. Then the awards. The first 2 were standard categories, operational excellence, safety leadership. I listened. I clapped. The table beside mine had a nominee for safety leadership, and there was a small, genuine cheer when his name was called. The room had the warm energy of a professional community that actually liked each other, which is not something you can fake at scale. Celia Marsh took the podium for the third award. She was a composed woman, somewhere in her mid-50s, with the manner of someone who had spent years managing complex industrial operations and had learned that precision and warmth were not opposites. She adjusted the microphone. She looked out at the room. This year, she said, the awards committee introduced a new category: environmental excellence in industrial operations. A small murmur of interest from the room. It was, genuinely, a new addition, and people were curious. This award recognizes compliance and consulting work that has materially protected member companies from environmental regulatory exposure. Work that is, by its nature, largely invisible until it isn't. Something in my hands went very quiet. The inaugural recipient of this award, Celia said, has held a licensed environmental professional designation for 9 years. She has worked with member companies across 11 facilities in this region over the past decade. In the past 18 months alone, the work her firm completed for one of our largest member organizations prevented a reportable incident that, by the committee's conservative estimate, would have resulted in regulatory penalties in the range of $200,000 to $350,000 and a remediation timeline of 3 to 5 years. She paused. The room was attending fully now. 220 people in a state of collective focus. She completed her first professional licensing examination at 25. She has renewed and expanded her credentials continuously for 17 years. She is, I'll note, one of fewer than 800 licensed environmental professionals currently certified in this state. My chest was entirely still. My hands were on the table, and they did not move. The first Environmental Excellence Award, Celia Marsh said, goes to Sera. I stood. The room applauded, real applause, not the polite kind, the kind that has weight behind it. The woman to my left, from the firm I'd worked with, put her hand briefly on my arm before I stood. The man across the table, whom I did not know, nodded with the specific respect of someone who recognized the credential she had just described. I walked to the podium. I shook Celia's hand. She handed me the award, a substantial glass piece with the association's seal and my name etched beneath it, and leaned toward the microphone with me standing beside her and said, 17 years, 1 license, and work that doesn't ask to be seen. I thanked the committee. I thanked my firm. I thanked Roz by first name, without explaining who she was, because she would know, and that was enough. I kept it to 45 seconds. I walked back to my table. On the way, I passed, at a distance of approximately 8 feet, the end of table E. My father was sitting with his hands flat on the tablecloth and his eyes on the glass piece in my hands, with the particular expression of a man who has just heard a sentence he does not know how to place inside the story he already has. He did not look up when I passed. I returned to my seat. I set the award on the table beside my water glass. The man across from me said, "Congratulations. That's serious work." I said thank you. The conversation resumed. The remaining portion of the dinner took approximately 45 minutes. 2 more awards, a closing address from Bill Tarrant, the informal dispersal that follows the end of a formal program, people rising, clustering, the volume of the room lifting as structure releases. I stayed at my table. I finished my coffee. A woman from the awards committee came to introduce herself and to say, in the sincere and slightly formal way of committee members who take their responsibilities seriously, that she was glad the category had been introduced and that my firm's work on the 11-facility audit had been what convinced them to make it a permanent category. I thanked her. 2 of the people from my table lingered to talk, the kind of unhurried professional conversation that only happens after the formal portion of an event, when people stop performing attention and actually give it. We talked about the January regulatory update, about a change in reporting protocols that was creating real administrative burden for smaller firms. It was genuinely a good conversation. Across the room, I was aware, without looking directly, that my father had not moved from his table. He came to find me at 8:47. I know the time because I had just glanced at my phone to see a text from Roz, who had, apparently, heard through some professional network channel that the award had been announced, because the text said simply, 800. One name, tonight.
Good.
I was reading it when my father appeared at the edge of my table. Sera. I looked up. I put my phone face down. Hi, Dad. He stood for a moment before sitting down in the vacant chair beside me. The people I'd been talking with had drifted toward the bar. We were briefly alone in the way that people are briefly alone in a thinning room, not private, but unattended. He had the award in his field of vision. He did not look at it directly. I didn't know, he said, about any of this. I know, I said. The dinner, the award. He paused. She said fewer than 800. In the state, I said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. He had the expression of a man doing arithmetic he hadn't expected to be assigned. Not defensive, not yet apologetic, but genuinely recalibrating. How long have you held it? The LEP? 9 years. I've had professional credentials of some kind since I was 25. He absorbed that. I knew you had a certification. I didn't know the scope. You never asked the specific question, I said. Not with heat. Just as the plain sentence it was. He didn't contest it. My father was not a man who contested plain sentences when they were accurate.
No, he said.
I didn't. Something moved in his jaw. Not quite a response. Not quite a suppression of one. He looked at the award. I told people, he said. Tonight before he stopped. I heard. I said. The word landed. His eyes came to mine and then moved away, and something across his shoulders settled differently, a fraction lower, less certain. I said you puttered. You said it wasn't a real job. He pressed his lips together and was quiet for several seconds. I'm sorry, Sera. Okay, I said. And then, because I meant it in the specific and limited way it was offered. Thank you for saying it. He nodded. He looked at the award again, the glass piece with the association seal, the etched letters of my name and credential and firm. The licensing ceremony, he said. A few years ago. I had the conference. Yes. He didn't say anything after that for a moment. Then, I would have come if I'd known what it meant.
I thought about that.
I know, I said. I think that's part of why I didn't explain it. He looked at me. It was the first time in years that my father had looked at me with the specific quality of attention he gave to things he was trying to understand, rather than things he had already categorized. That's fair, he said. It was 3 words and they cost him something, and I could see it, and I credited him for it. We sat for another few minutes. Not long. The room was dispersing around us. Eventually he stood and said he was going to find his colleagues and said goodnight, and I said goodnight, and he paused at the edge of the table and looked back once briefly at the award, and then he was gone. I sat for another 10 minutes. I finished my coffee. I put the award carefully in a canvas tote I'd brought for exactly this purpose. The awards committee had told me it would be substantial, and to bring something to carry it in. I pulled on my coat. A man I didn't know stopped me near the exit. He had a name badge from a manufacturing company I recognized as a mid-sized regional operation. He said, "Are you the Kowalski who did the remediation framework for Hartwell Industrial in 2019? I said yes. He said, "I've been trying to find out who wrote that framework for 2 years. It saved us from a nearly identical situation 6 months later. We just used it as a template." I said I was glad it had been useful. He shook his head slowly. Not incredulous, just genuinely struck. He shook my hand and said it was a pleasure. I walked out to the parking structure. I put the award on the passenger seat. I drove home. My father called me the following Saturday morning. Not the next day, he needed the week, and I understood that, and I did not call him either. When he called, he sounded like himself, but with something quieter underneath, the way a room sounds different after the furniture has been rearranged. He asked if I had time to talk. I said yes. "I want to understand what you actually do," he said. "If you're willing to explain it." This was, in 17 years, the first time he had asked that specific question with that specific intention, not to be polite, not to transition to another subject, but because he wanted the information. I told him. I kept it practical, the framework of what environmental compliance means for industrial operations, what a licensed environmental professional can sign off on that others cannot, what the audit process looks like, what the regulatory exposure calculus is. I kept the jargon to a minimum and used the vocabulary of procurement and operations where I could, because that was the language he actually spoke. He asked questions. Good questions, not basic ones, but the questions of someone with 30 years of industrial operations knowledge trying to map a new terrain onto existing structure. It took about 40 minutes. At the end of it, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The penalties Celia mentioned. 2 to 350,000. Conservative estimate," I said. "The actual remediation costs would have been higher." Another silence. "That's real money. That's why the work is real," I said. He exhaled. "I said things to people at that table. Before the dinner. I know. People from my company. I know, Dad. I'm going to correct it," he said. "Not as a question. Not as a negotiation. As a statement of intention." "You don't have to," I said. "I want to," he said. I said it. I should correct it. I didn't argue. I believed him. The correction, when it came, was quiet and thorough in the way my father did things. I heard about it gradually, through channels I wouldn't have expected. 3 weeks after the dinner, my cousin Tanya called me. She worked in a completely different industry, had no connection to any of this, and said, "What did you do?" Uncle Jerry called my mom and spent 20 minutes explaining what an LEP is. A month after the dinner, Patrick texted me. "Dad showed me the photo from the dinner. The award thing," he said, and I quote, "I didn't understand what she did. I do now. That's basically a papal apology from Dad, so." I wrote back, "I know." Then, yeah, my mother called at some point in there and said, "I always knew you were good at what you did. I'm sorry I didn't ask better questions." I told her it was okay, and with her it actually was completely, because her interest had always been genuine and only her vocabulary had been lacking. Roz called on a Sunday, as she often did, and I told her the whole story. She listened without interrupting, which was not always her way, and when I finished she said, "How did it feel?" Not him.
You.
"How did it feel to walk up there?" I thought about it. "Like the work was visible," I said. "Just for a minute. In a room that would know what it meant." "That's all it needed to be," she said. We talked for another hour about nothing in particular. At one point she mentioned that she'd been approached about doing some consulting work for a state regulatory board and was considering it. I told her she should. She said she probably would. We talked about fly fishing for 15 minutes, because Roz was genuinely passionate about it, and I was genuinely interested in anything she was passionate about. It was a good call. The cascade from the dinner was not dramatic. No screaming. No family confrontation. No formal reckoning. What there was instead was a slow and genuine shift in the way my father talked about me. Not an announcement, but a correction that worked itself through his professional and social world the way corrections do when they come from someone who takes accuracy seriously. By summer, at a family gathering, he introduced me to a neighbor I hadn't met before as my daughter Sera. She's an environmental compliance specialist. She holds a state license in the field. It's significant work. He said it with the specific precision of someone who has recently looked something up and wants to get it right. The neighbor asked a follow-up question. My father partially answered it and then said, "Sera, you explain it better," and turned to me. I explained it. The neighbor was genuinely interested. My father listened. It was, I am aware, not a large thing. It was a recalibration, not a transformation. My father did not become someone who asked about regulatory frameworks at Christmas dinner. He remained the person he had always been, practical, organized, loyal to the people and institutions he had built his life around. But the file he had for me, the one labeled putters, was quietly replaced with something more accurate, and that mattered in a way I found difficult to fully quantify, and did not try to. At the following year's association dinner, which I attended again because the firm had ongoing relationships with member companies, I arrived in the main hall and found my father already there with his colleagues. He saw me across the room and crossed it, which he had not done before, and introduced me to his operations director as Sera Kowalski. She received the Environmental Excellence Award last year. She's the one who did the Hartwell Audit Framework. The operations director said, "I know that framework. We use it as a template, And my father's expression had exactly the quality of a man who has just discovered that something he had undervalued was worth considerably more than he'd priced it. I shook the director's hand and said it was good to meet her. My father stood slightly taller than he'd been standing a moment before. I noted this and said nothing about it. Roz turned 68 in October. I drove up on a Friday afternoon, and we spent the weekend at the lake. She fished. I read on the dock and periodically handed her things from the tackle box, and she explained what the things were and why she was choosing them with the specificity of someone who believes that knowing the name of a thing is the beginning of respecting it. We ate well. We talked about everything: the regulatory board consulting she had taken on, a case she was following peripherally from retirement, a book I'd been reading, a licensing framework she thought was going to be revised in the next legislative session, and what that would mean for practitioners in my field. On Sunday morning over coffee, she said, "Last year at the dinner, your father." "Yes," I said. "Are you good?" I thought about it. Outside, the lake was flat and gray and perfectly still, the way water gets in the early morning before the wind picks up. "Yes," I said. "I think I actually am." She nodded. She poured more coffee. That was the end of it. There is something I want to say about being misread by people who love you. It is not the same as being hated. I want to be precise about that because I think those two things get collapsed sometimes in stories like this one, and they shouldn't. My father did not hate my career. He didn't understand it, and he stopped trying to understand it, and the story he told in the Gap was shaped by the only vocabulary he had, which was the vocabulary of visible, legible, titled work. He was not cruel. He was limited. Those are different things. Being limited is something that can change. And in my father's case, it did, not dramatically, not all at once, not with any kind of formal acknowledgement. Just a slow, accurate correction of an inaccurate file. That is, I think, the best you can ask for from a person who is trying, in their way, to get it right. The harder thing, the thing I sat with for longer, was my own role in the 17 years. I had stopped explaining. I had decided at some point that it was easier to exist in the categorized version of myself than to keep pushing against it. That was a choice I made. I own it. It came from fatigue and from something that felt like self-protection and from a genuine uncertainty about whether understanding was available even if I offered it. Maybe it wasn't for a long time. By the end, I think it was. I waited too long to find out. What I know now is that credentials don't require an audience to be real. The work was real in the field, in the reports, in the audit frameworks that other firms used as templates years later. The license was real at 25 and real at 34 and will be real in 10 years. The room at the dinner didn't make it real. It just made it visible, in a place where visible meant something to the people I'd spent 17 years being invisible to. That was enough. I am not sure it needed to be more. My father keeps a photo from the dinner, the one the association photographer took when I was at the podium, Celia Marsh handing me the award. I know this because he mentioned, casually 6 months later, that he'd had it framed. I did not make anything of this. Neither did he. It lives on his desk at work, apparently, alongside a photo of Patrick at some logistics conference and one of Becca at her nursing school graduation. 3 children. 3 frames. It took 17 years and a Thursday evening in March for all 3 to be there. I'll take it. That is my story. A glass award, a licensing document, and 17 years of invisible work. Here is what I want to ask you, because I have thought about it since that night. If you had overheard what my father said about you, from 2 tables away, before you knew the evening was about to turn, would you have walked over and introduced yourself right then? Or would you have done what I did? Put the badge in your pocket, gone to your seat, and waited for the room to say it for you? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.